Welcome to another episode of the Sfarim Chatter podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by Chemed Health. To sponsor an episode of the podcast or to support the podcast, please email me, sfarimchatter@gmail.com, or you can check out the links and information in the show's notes below. Just a note about this episode, this is an older recording from when I used to use Zoom, and so apologies about the audio quality not being up to the current standards. You can also find a link in the show's notes to subscribe to the Sfarim Chatter WhatsApp community, where I post new books, new Sfarim, book deals, and so on. And finally, if you can please subscribe to the podcast and rate and review it wherever it is that you listen, 24/6, Apple, Spotify, and so on. And with that, enjoy the episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Sfarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined once again by Dr. Jeremy Brown, who is a physician and historian of science and medicine, who directs the Office of Emergency Care Research at the National Institutes of Health. And we will be discussing his new book titled The 11th Plague, Jews and Pandemics from the Bible to COVID-19, published by Oxford University Press. It's a pretty large book. I'll say it'll come in a few hundred pages. And really a history of, like it says, Jews and pandemics, and various, we'll get into various aspects of that, and there's full of sources, and there's a lot to discuss here. So thank you, Dr. Brown, for joining me once again.
My pleasure indeed.
So the book says, like I said, the title is From the Bible to COVID-19, but I should point out, even though there's a bit on COVID here, it is not a COVID-19 book. It's a book on history. It's a Jewish medical history kind of a book. But what was the kind of how was this initiated by COVID, or was this something you were working on beforehand and COVID just popped up?
Yeah. So without doubt, this predated COVID. I had been collecting a lot of material when I started the DAF. Much of that material made its way into a blog that I have called Talmudology, where we discuss science and medicine in the Talmud based on the Daf Yomi cycle. So I collected a lot of material, and there was also a lot of material that I wasn't able to use on Talmudology. And then COVID came along, and I think of COVID as my catalyst, but not my inspiration. I had actually planned or thought that it would be a good idea to write about the Jewish encounter with infectious disease as its own topic. And that was a book that I had thought to write. And then along came COVID, and it gave me the prod that I needed, and the book is the result. It virtually wrote itself. I mean, it was such a pleasure to research and write. Every day I would discover new material that I shared with friends and shared with my family, and there was so much good material there that it was really my job was just to bring out the material.
Right. So now the structure of the book, let's just talk about that, and then we'll get into different parts. At the beginning, you kind of go through Tanakh, and then you go into Chazal, and then kind of from there, you kind of go through. It's not really chronologically. You kind of, even though there's a map chart we'll talk about, you kind of go through it by topic almost. The Black Death, bubonic plague, or some people call it plague, but we'll try to be more definitive here. Black Death, and then you go through smallpox, cholera, and others, and then you get into religious responses to pandemics, cameas or amulets, plague weddings, a lot of really fascinating things, and then you'll have anti-Jewish responses to pandemics, and of course, there is vaccination and COVID-19. So that's kind of the overview, and we'll go through, we'll work through some of it. It's a very interesting book with a lot there. So let's talk about, in the beginning, you go through, like I said, Tanakh, and you go through Chazal. I mean, you can kind of, like, what was it like researching and writing that? It's a little different than the rest of the book, though. It's a different style. It's a different kind of thing than just researching something more historical.
Right. I mean, when we start with I open with, of course, with the most famous plagues or pandemics in the world, and those are without a doubt, for those of us, at least those of us in the West, it's the Pesach Seder, the Pesach Seder, which really revolves around the story of 10 pandemics, and that really was that's the launching point. It's interesting to think about this, and this is one of the ways I think that I have shifted a little bit in my thinking about how I approach Pesach. We think about pandemics, and then we have this Pesach, which now we have 10 plague finger puppets, and we have 10 plague nail decals. Why is this manicure different from all other manicures? And my family, we throw ping pong balls, and there are sheep on the table, little stuffed sheep, and there are cows that are upside down. And we are so comfortable with this idea that it's become an object of entertainment. And yet we're supposed to remove a drop of wine. We're supposed to pause and stop because of the reality of what happened to those who were on the receiving end of these plagues. I think for a long time, people have had this distinction between plagues and pandemics as something that happened historically or was out there, and then suddenly the realization that it actually happened to us in our own specific way. So Pesach is a very good launching point to think about what happened then and how it has changed for us.
Yeah, and that's really, the book is the 11th plague. So kind of
the 11th plague. Yeah, the 11th plague is the stand-in for everything that happened after the 10 plagues and Yetziat Mitzrayim.
So chapter 2 is interesting. I think it's well worth discussing, which is, you title it "The Angel of the Death Walks in the Middle of the Road," and the subtitle is "Pandemics in the Talmud and the Question of Fleeing." And this is something that's very interesting, comes up in Chazal, in the Gemara. What does a person do when there is a plague? What should you do?
Right. And you would think that there would be a lot written on the Talmud, but in fact, the source text for this is a Gemara in Bava Kama, and it basically, the Gemara there says very small passage that says, if there's a plague in your city, gather your feet, meaning stay indoors. And the proof text is, this is the pasuk that reminds us during Makas Pachoros that nobody should leave the opening of their house until morning. So Chazal saw that as a way to deal with pandemics. Then there's then Rava says that he would close the windows, and finally there's a Mama Chazal that a person shouldn't walk in the middle of the road if there's a pandemic, because the angel of death walks in the middle of the road. And then goes on to say, and if there's a pandemic, you shouldn't go into the shul alone, because the angel of death somehow leaves his kalim, his utensils there. That is the total sum of the source text for how we as halachic Jews should behave during a pandemic. Now, of course, there's much more written about this, and there's plenty more in the Talmud about pandemics. But that is, if you like, the source material for staying versus fleeing. And actually, in the book, I think about the ways in which staying and fleeing have been interpreted both in Jewish texts and also in other religious traditions, because they're actually quite different.
Now, the other interesting thing is you go on to say pandemic behavior in early codes of Jewish law. So talking about the Rif and the Rambam and the Rush. And then going on, not halachic work, but you talk about the Marsha, the Ben Ish Chai, there's the things talking about the Gemara. So if you want to mention that.
Yeah, so this is an example, I think, where what we see in these early codes of Jewish law, in other words, before the Shulchan Aruch, is that many times the halacha was clearly following what people were doing. This was an example, and there are many examples of this, of course, but it wasn't that the halacha came a priori before people were sort of, they would look to the text and decide how they should best respond to it. But what you have, in fact, is clear that the poskim was seeing that people were fleeing, and the Maharil in particular is one example of this, who cited the permission to allow Jews to flee, and even though they're, as the Gemara we just cited in Bava Kama says, even though that Gemara says you should stay indoors, you shouldn't flee. So what you have here is an interesting phenomena of the halacha following what became normative Jewish practice, and not the other way around.
Right, and you discussed the Marshal and the Ramah, and there's a lot of very interesting, to see how they actually did it. And like you said, you do contrast that with Martin Luther, Muslim law. You try to bring a contrast to the non-Jewish world as well.
Yeah, Martin Luther is a particularly interesting example. I do quote him with hesitation. Obviously, he was a notorious anti-Semite. But the reason I spent a couple of pages on him is because he published a work in 1527, right around the time of these of the poskim that we were just mentioning. He published this work on whether one has to flee death. In other words, as a Christian, should I stay put, or should and heal, and minister to the sick, or should I run away? And his Luther's position on this was very different. It was that we are in the hands of God, and we should stay where we are, minister to the sick, and not run away, even though this fleeing was normative Jewish practice. And I list many people, many great poskim, including the Ramah himself, who spent time in the field during a terrible outbreak of the Black Death. So you have here Martin Luther puskening, if you like, for his own community, that we need to stay put, minister to the sick. But you have Jews and Jewish communities that were living at exactly the same time who felt that it was entirely appropriate to leave and look after yourself first. And then the late Chief Rabbi Emanuel Jakobowitz put it very nicely. In one of his books, he wrote that the cult of self-sacrifice to the point of death never appealed to the Jew. He generally preferred living in misery to dying in glory. And this sort of, I think, is one of the many interesting examples in the book of how Jewish practice and practice outside of the Jewish community sometimes overlap and sometimes differ.
As you mentioned, the Ramah famously wrote Mechir Yayin, his commentary on Esther, while he was fleeing from pandemic. And we have other Sfarim as well. The Maharal's brother, Sefer HaChaim, there he was locked in his house. He didn't run away. He was just, when he says, and he wrote in his introduction. So then we move on to really the kind of the most famous plague, infamous, which is the Black Death, the bubonic plague. Mm-hmm. Let's start off talking about explaining what is the Black Death, bubonic plague, how they thought it was caused, what its symptoms are, what caused it, what they think, what do we know now, and then we'll get into Jewish responses, and we'll talk about various, because Black Death's been going on for
years. So the Black Death it's called the Black Death by popular, in popular literature, but it is bubonic plague. Bubonic plague is spread by a bacteria called Yersinia pestis that was discovered in 1894, and it lives on fleas, and the fleas so the bacteria is in the fleas, and the fleas live in the rats. So the more that you have mice and rats around, the more fleas there are, and the more bubonic plague there is. It was called the Black Death because it comes from the Latin arta mors, meaning terrible and black. So you have the word atra meaning black, and also atra meaning terrible, so it became called the Black Death. It could also refer to the fact that sometimes there was gangrene that set in the fingers and toes and the extremities. But the Black Death is bubonic plague. There are still cases of bubonic plague to this day, perhaps around 1,000 in the world. We actually also have a few, maybe a dozen cases of it in the United States every year. I have never seen a case of bubonic plague, even though I worked in emergency rooms for many, for a couple of decades. But it's still a disease that is that is around, and it was a most terrible disease. We know of a number of waves, and I discussed many of waves in the book. But the first greatest wave, if you like, became known as the Black Death, which was the pandemic of bubonic plague that really affected Europe and North Africa from about 1346 to about 1353. So it was about a 7-year period, and it killed about 60% of the population. And of course, there are two aspects to the Jewish story of the Black Death. The first is what happened to the Jewish communities, and I talk about that in detail from fascinating sources and diaries and Shiloh and Chuvot. And then, of course, there was the terrible way in which the pogroms followed the Jews who were accused of poisoning the wells. So Jews had sort of this double nightmare of both surviving the pandemic and then surviving the terrible anti-Jewish massacres that followed.
Just two things to follow up. First of all, I don't want to be too gory, but if you want to describe the symptoms of the bubonic plague, just to clarify what it, I mean, you do in the book, what it's explain what it is and what happened, and you explained how it was spread. Also, you mentioned the earlier one, but there are earlier. I think you talk about maybe in Sefer Shmuel it was referring to plague, as well as by Justinian, the plague of Justinian. Also, is that a bubonic plague? So we know it occurred earlier, also at least 1,000
Yes,
years, if not
indeed.
more.
Yeah, if we think about Sefer Shmuel in this, just very briefly, there is the story of the ark being captured by the Philistines, and they put it into a temple to Dagon, and there's this terrible outbreak of swellings that follows, and there's a lot of kriuk what these things mean, and the most likely explanation. And I go into sort of detail as to why this would be the case, but the most likely explanation is that the Philistine epidemic was indeed bubonic plague. I talk about the evidence for that, and indeed it was painted as such by a number of artists, perhaps most famously Nicholas Poussin in his 1630 Plague of Ashdod, which I reproduced in the book, but should definitely be looked at in color. And it's really a shocking picture of an outbreak of bubonic plague that followed this the Philistine capture of the temple, of the ark. But the artist knew what he was painting because he had survived several outbreaks of plague himself. So he was using his own experience of having lived through the plague, bubonic plague locally. And then he painted his imaginative interpretation of the plague of Ashdod as it is mentioned in Sefer Shmuel. So that is our example of bubonic plague in Sefer Shmuel. I mean, there's lots more to say about plagues in the Tanakh itself. There's just very briefly, the plagues are interestingly related to the census. That whenever the Torah and indeed Nach speaks about taking a census, there was this mysterious connection about a kofer, and that you would have to pay a kofer for in order that you would avoid a plague. There is the story of David HaMelech, and who tells his military advisor Yoav to go count people, and Yoav is reluctant, and he says, "Why do I have to do this?" And plagues follow. So there is this interesting connection between a kofer, between a plague, and between the census. And as I mentioned in the book, almost certainly this points to actually something that predated the Bible and was related to a fear of counting in the ancient Near East, in Mesopotamia, where we have early what's the right word? Early we have to describe them. They're ostragon. They're basically bits of pottery on which we have some scribbles. And in those ancient Mesopotamian scribbles, there are several deities that associate plagues and pandemics. So whatever it was that the Bible was, that the Tanakh was picking up on, certainly has been around in the Near East for many centuries before, and shows that there's this relationship between the census and the plagues that follow. So that was just sort of walking backwards a little bit. You asked me about the symptoms for bubonic plague. They really are quite gory. They start with a cough, perhaps, shortness of breath, fever. Sometimes plague is can kill somebody within about 36 hours of contracting it. Other times the person would linger for longer. The death rate was somewhere between 50 and 60, 70%, something like that. So people did survive it, but it was a minority of people. If you contracted the plague, bubonic plague, then you would have a very high probability of dying, and dying in a particularly nasty way.
Did the survivors who contracted it, those few that were lucky, were they immune?
Yes, they were. Yes, they were. And this is also true of the other diseases like smallpox, and the immunity of people who survive smallpox is a story of its own that I tell in a different chapter, and I hope we'll get to. But yes, theoretically, you were indeed less likely to catch it a second time, for what that was worth.
Right, exactly. I don't mean to say that it was, it was a very low likelihood. There was the lucky few. It was a really terrible thing. And you mentioned, and we'll go to the main one. And there were accusations, pogroms after well poisoning. I discussed this. I'll mention already here. I did a podcast with Dr. Tzarfir Barzilai on his book Poisoned Wells. He has a book on that. That was a previous podcast episode. But it's worth discussing here as well. Not so much the well poisoning accusations. I'll leave that for his podcast and his book. But something that you tackle is that this persistent kind of legend / myth that Jews died at a lower rate than non-Jews during the Black Death. I guess always, but mainly that first outbreak, but in general. And that led to a lot of the anti-Semitic outbreaks. And I guess kind of the prevailing view is they did so because Jews were always washing. In medieval times, people didn't wash, but Jews were always washing halachically. There was nida, so we had mikvah, and there was all sorts of things that Jews were cleaner. However, this is not exactly the case as you have shown. Also, I mean, this kind of makes sense, especially as you go through time. Jews were crammed into a ghetto later on, and that leads to very unsanitary conditions. They're very not as sanitary. So I'll let you talk about the research that you went into, where the myth /legend comes from, and its theory, and then how you kind of debunk it or counter it, at least.
I talked to a lot of people about this myth, and I certainly grew up in London knowing that the Jews, I somehow imbibed this story that the Jews were saved by halakha in the great bubonic plague, the Black Death. Where it came from, I can't tell you, but I explored it because it came up time and again, and it was given as a reason to think that the Jews were behind the poisonings. Why would you think that the Jews were behind the poisonings? Well, because they weren't dying in the same number as everybody else, so they must have known to avoid certain things, and from there you build up this theory. It is a theory that unfortunately has absolutely no historic basis whatsoever. All the evidence that we have is that the Jews died in a similar or greater number than everybody else. Perhaps the deaths were delayed. For example, the Jews lived in a ghetto, as you mentioned, and if you were not in contact with the general population, as the plague came in, as bubonic plague, came into a city, the Jews might be the very last people to catch it because they were surrounded by essentially by a wall, and because they had little interaction with the rest of the community. So sometimes the Jews would be the last people to catch bubonic plague, but once it got into their communities, once it got into the ghetto, the death rate was as high, if not higher. Other times, however, the Jews were the very first people to catch the plague. And so you see that there was no sort of clear pattern there. The first claim that the Jews died in lesser number is actually from a sefer called Yosef HaKohen's Emek HaBacha, which was compiled in 1558. And he is not an eyewitness to the bubonic plague, but he starts the story. And from there, it spread to other great writers like the Tzemach David, Rav David Gans, whose history of the Jewish people was first published in 1592, and it has been translated many, many times, including into Latin and German and Yiddish. And he writes how in 1348 there was a pandemic, and he writes that there were only a few deaths among the Jews, and because of this, there was great enmity in Spain and France, where the Christians claimed that the Jews had poisoned the wells. So here you have another non-eyewitness telling of the story. It then spreads to 19th century Heinrich Getz's History of the Jews, where it's mentioned, and then there's a Hebrew translation of that where it's further embellished, and it for some interesting set of reasons, it spreads to anti-Semites at MIT around the beginning of the 20th century, who, while they were terrifically anti-Semitic people, they thought that the Mosaic law and hygiene surrounding particularly the laws about kashrut would have prevented the Jews from catching a bubonic plague in the same numbers. And then we see this legend or this myth, what I call it, the myth of Jewish pandemic exceptionalism. We see it in contemporary sources. It's mentioned on the website of Bet Hatzfut, or what used to be called Bet Hatzfutzot, the Museum of the Jewish People in Tel Aviv, where they mention it, but they're not really quite sure if it's true. Beryl Wine mentions it as a reason for the outbreak of the pogroms. And so there is this, the story has had a life of its own. But as I say, if you go back and look at the original sources, both Jewish and Gentile, including, for example, the Pope himself, Pope Clement VI, wrote in 1350s, 1348, that it was completely impossible for the Jews to have been behind the plague because they were dying in great numbers just like everybody else. So the story, I unpack the story and talk about eyewitnesses. I also do a deep dive into some of the other claims that have been made that Jewish burial customs, for example, were very different to non-Jewish ones, and that would help prevent the spread of disease. That Bikur Cholim, the requirement to visit the sick, would have helped. Of course, that requirement is to visit the sick; it's not to nurse to the sick. And if anything, the requirement to visit the sick with an infectious disease would spread the disease. Indeed, that's why during COVID-19, many shaylas and tshuvas were asked about, must I visit somebody in person and risk catching the disease, or can I do Bikur Cholim by Zoom or by phone? So actually visiting the sick was a way of spreading the disease. Sadly, the myth of Jewish pandemic exceptionalism is just that. It is a myth. Why we like to tell it, I'll leave for people telling the story to sort of think about it. But it's not anything that has the slightest hint of fact behind it. And as I said, in fact, the historical record shows quite the opposite.
Yeah, like you mentioned, you have other contemporary, sources from the time period, and you have, you mentioned the Pope who was defending the Jews, and he says that they died. I mean, he literally, like you say, Yosef HaKohen was the historian, Emek HaBacha, which there's a new edition a few years ago, Magnus Press by Professor Reuven Bonfil, and he did a number of other works by Yosef HaKohen, and that's a few hundred years later that's coming, and that's really spreading from there. Now, talking about the Black Death, the one other thing, I don't know if you do discuss some later episodes, a variety of episodes, not only the one in the 14th century, and also the Jewish responses. What are the Jewish responses to outbreaks of bubonic plague?
Yeah. So we know that the bubonic plague is the only disease, if you like, in the book, which has two separate chapters. So I analyze separately the response of the Jewish communities to the bubonic plague itself, sort of the medical, religious responses, and also in a separate chapter, I analyze as I said, the pogroms that followed, and that's a story in itself. I think one really interesting story about the way in which people coped is told by Glickl of Hamlin, the woman who remarkably kept a diary of her life, and she tells the story of what happened when the plague reached her, reached where she and her grandmother were living, and it's a story that you can very quickly sort of, when you read her eyewitness account, you can get a sense of what had happened. Glickl had lost her grandmother in one of the outbreaks of plague. She lost her uncle Mordechai and her aunt in this outbreak. And actually, Glickl tells us what happened when she noticed it was just during the first days of Sukkot in 1664. So there's Glickl in Hamlin, and it's the first days of Sukkot, and she noticed that her little daughter Tzipor has a boo-boo under her arm, a swelling. And of course, this was one of the first signs of bubonic plague. That's where the word buboes comes from. Buboes mean swellings. And Glickl tells us what this would have meant, that it would have meant that she would have had to be put in isolation. I mean, we think of these times as very brutal and perhaps no laws, but there were many laws that communities had in terms of caring for the sick, and we can talk about them perhaps separately. But so Glickl has to basically smuggle her daughter with one of her maids out of Hamelin to a local community where she can sort of go unnoticed and hopefully prevent her and her family from going into quarantine. It's just an example, if you like, of the real world situation in which Jews in the 17th century found themselves. And Glickl mentions in addition that she later looked after earlier her grandmother had looked after the Jewish refugees from Vilna who had arrived in Hamburg around 1655. And her grandmother, she writes, cared for these refugees from the plague and the sick. And she insisted on doing this, she writes, over the protests of my father. And in the end, Glickl writes that her grandmother, caught the disease and lay dying sick for 10 days until she died at a ripe old age with a good name. So there is an example of selfless giving from Glickl's grandmother to take care of refugees from another Jewish community who had contracted the plague.
Yeah, speaking of Glickl, if listeners aren't familiar, there will be a podcast on Glickl. So I don't. Maybe that one will come out before this one, but whatever. I'm just if it didn't, and listeners aren't familiar, there's Glickl is fascinating.
A couple of really good translations of her work. It's worth spending an afternoon just reading her diary. It's quite remarkable.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so the next thing to move on to is smallpox, which you alluded to smallpox already, and smallpox is going to get us to vaccination, inoculation. The difference between the two, which I learned from your book. I don't think I knew that before. You can explain that to everybody. But let's talk about, as you call it, God has opened the eyes of the wise-hearted Dr. Jenner. And where that quote comes from, it's an interesting quote. I think that's from the First Yisrael, right? But let's talk about Dr. Jenner and smallpox. What is smallpox and Jewish responses, etc.?
So neither I nor probably the overwhelming majority of people listening to this have ever encountered smallpox. It was eradicated from the face of the earth in 1979. It is one of only two diseases that humanity has literally removed from the face of the earth, and the smallpox virus, it is a virus, is now only kept in a couple of experimental laboratory freezers, and you can't find it anymore. So the story of how we went from a disease that was a notorious killer, especially of children. There's evidence of smallpox going way back, and the disease was prevalent in Europe, and it was a terrible killer. The virus would begin with chills and body aches, basically like you felt like you had flu. The fever might then subside, but by 4 or 5 days, you would start having these terrible sores in the mouth, the nose, perhaps the eyes. Sometimes the smallpox pustules would grow and occlude the airway, and then the victim would suffocate. Sometimes they rupture a blood vessel internally and they bleed to death. Skin would slough off. It was a terrible, terrible disease that if you survived it, and the mortality was about 60%. But if you survived it, you were often badly maimed. You could be blind, for example, from the smallpox pustules that had scarred the cornea. And you might also have difficulty walking because the skin on the feet might not recover. So it was a terrible disease that took about 60% of the people who were, 40 to 60% of the people who caught it. And it was a disease that was greatly feared, but interestingly, there was something that you could do about it. And that's where we come to the story of inoculation and vaccination. So the story briefly is this, that for many centuries, and nobody knows how many centuries, people had known, and people here, including Chinese and people in India and Africa, had known that you could prevent people from catching smallpox by inoculating them with some pus from somebody who had themselves caught smallpox. So it was possible to take some pus from one of these oozing pustules from someone who was sick, to inoculate it, to put it under the skin of somebody else who had not caught the disease. And if you were lucky, and if you did it just right, and if there was just enough vaccine, just enough inoculation, but not too much, then that person would develop mild fevers and chills, but happily not develop full smallpox and would then become immune to the disease. And that is called smallpox inoculation, from the Latin inoculare, meaning to graft, because they would graft pus from the victim into a healthy person. Now, of course, this is a very intellectually counterintuitive thing to do, to take pus from somebody and put it into a perfectly healthy person. Remember, this is before the germ theory of disease, before we understood what bacteria were. Nobody knew why this would work. They knew that it worked, but it didn't make a whole lot of sense, if you like. You were also in the position that if you were an adult, and most adults had caught smallpox and survived. That's why they were adults. But many times it was the children who had yet to catch the smallpox who were the ones that the parents would have to decide whether to inoculate. And the problem with inoculation was it was very easy to get it wrong. If you didn't put enough of the material from the donor into the skin, the person would never become immune. They wouldn't get what we would call today an immune response. If you put too much in, or you put it in too deeply, they would develop full-blown smallpox and die. And the death rate from the inoculation itself was anywhere between 2 and 5%, something like that. And there's no question about that. There was a persistent risk of death from the smallpox inoculation. And that's where the poskim came in and opined as to whether or not one should put themselves in a suffix sakana, which was the smallpox vaccine, the smallpox inoculation, in order to avoid the plague. And all this changed with Edward Jenner and his development of the cowpox vaccine. Cowpox is a cousin of smallpox, and it elicits the same immune reaction, but it doesn't cause smallpox. And Jenner noticed that the milkmaids who were milking the cows and got smallpox, which is basically a few sort of little swellings on the back of the hands and it goes away, they never caught smallpox. And famously, he took some of these smallpoxes and he inoculated a little boy called James Phipps. And then, get this, Jenner deliberately exposed Phipps to smallpox a little time later and demonstrated that the new way of giving smallpox, which he called vaccination because it comes from vaccinia, which means a cow in Latin. It comes from cowpox. He developed a way of vaccinating people in such a way that there was not the risk of disease and death, which the smallpox inoculation originally went with. And then this smallpox vaccine spread far and wide, and it became the subject of a lot of shaylas and shuvas, and a lot of Jewish support for it when people realized that it did not carry the risk of the initial smallpox inoculation.
So let's unpack that a little bit further. So first of all, inoculation, as you said, did have a 2 to 5% mortality. It was definitely a dangerous procedure. There was a percentage. So what was the reaction of the poskim to inoculation? Before we got to Jenner's cowpox vaccine, what was the poskim's reaction?
Right. So what we see is people who are really weighing the question of the amount of risk, and these are really the sources in many ways for later questions about risk and disease. There are the one that I quote at length in my book is Yishmael HaKohen of Medina, who died in 1811, and he wrote a long tshuva, which is actually quite a frustrating tshuva to read. But he wrote a long tshuva about whether one should get the inoculazione. And so again, this is before Jenner. This is the inoculation that has a 2 to 5% risk of death. And the reason that his tshuva is somewhat frustrating to read is that he goes back and forth. He says, well, yes, inoculation is life-threatening, but so is smallpox. why should we threaten? Why should we put our children at risk? They may not develop smallpox. And then he goes on to say, but no, maybe there is a risk that death will, that they will catch smallpox. So maybe we should be getting. He kind of goes back and forth on this subject, but in the end, he hedges and he says that in places where there's a practice to give the inoculation, Yeshal Milasmoch, basically, you can rely on that. And even if it carries a small death rate, even if there was a small number of people who certainly would die from it, he says that you can still go ahead and take that chance if you like. But it was it's an infuriating read, because it's very hard to figure out exactly how he's coming down on this. And you can imagine you were a parent, right? Imagine you were a parent and you had survived smallpox and you had children running around the house who were 4, 5, and 6. And you had to decide, should I take my chances? My child might A, never get smallpox, unlikely, but it's possible. B, get smallpox and live, certainly possible, and then would become immune. Or do I now take my perfectly healthy 4-year-old and inoculate them with this disease, again, with no understanding of why it should work, and hoping that the amount of material was just right. The people who did inoculation charged a lot of money for it because they had to be expert. They had to get the right amount of pus in from the right donor who didn't have the disease too badly, and at the right depth of skin, so that it caused an immune reaction, but didn't overwhelm the body. I mean, this is a terrifically difficult decision for a parent to make back in the 18th century. Fortunately, we don't have to make that decision today with our vaccines, which are, of course, absolutely different. Let's just make sure we say that now. So the poskim were rightly perplexed by it, and we have poskim who wrote that the smallpox inoculation was forbidden, but that the smallpox vaccine was an entirely different story. And that, for example, I cite many books that write in this way, but perhaps the most important one is Sefer HaBris, that was published in 1797 by Pinchas Horowitz. It's been called the most widely read Jewish book of all time, presumably because it has been in print continuously since 1797. And in the book, which is a 2-part book, in the first part of the book, he writes about the importance of Jenner's work and the importance of how the vaccine can really save people. So there was an overwhelming enthusiasm for Jenner's vaccine, which thankfully replaced the much more tricky and dangerous smallpox inoculation. And the vaccine was so successful that within a few years after it became law, you had to vaccinate your children in England. There was also rulings about it in the United States. The disease essentially died out. And then, of course, there were various outbreaks here and there, but some of our parents, great-grandparents, great-grandparents would have been inoculated against this disease. But as I said, since 1979, there have been no more smallpox in the world. Israel dealt with its own smallpox outbreak, which I talk about separately in the book. So the poskim really reflected, I think, the hesitation of society at large about the inoculation, but welcomed the vaccine, as did society at large.
Yeah. So a couple of things. First of all, you mentioned Rishmal Kayan of Madana, which is Zera Emes. He was one of the great poskim in Italy in the 18th century, although he died in 1811. He was old. He also was a Napoleon Sanhedrin at the end. There's actually been a new edition of his Chuvas, Zera Emes by Avat Shalom, recently, 3 volumes, as you discuss. And then you mentioned the vaccine, the smallpox vaccine. So first of all, you mentioned already, as you know, the chassid, I think, is Jenner, which is how the Tiferes Yisrael Lifshitz refers to him. There's some other, you mentioned Sefer HaBris, which is a a very famous work of medicine, hashkafa, and there's a lot in there. I forgot to bring my Sefer HaBris, but we're recording this, but I have your English translation, how you discussed where he says, even though I have generally endeavored to be brief when it comes to this issue, I've gone into great detail in order to stimulate interest about this therapy among my people. They should not fear this dangerous, or that using it is, heaven forbid, sinful. Now that it is known not to be dangerous, the sin will fall on every father and mother whose entire labor and toil is to improve the life expectancy of their children. Anyone who waits and allows natural smallpox to infect their children with its terrible consequences, heaven forbid, will need to give an account before God and will certainly be punished by heaven. Which is very, very strongly worded, and which, as you say, Sefer HaBris, which is, it's still popular today, but if listeners aren't familiar, was a majorly influential Sefer. So if this is being put out in a Sefer, like he's writing it really, really strongly, which is definitely something that kind of probably caused the.
They didn't mince their words. I'll speak about one of my favorite historical poskim, David Friesenhuisen and Mosdot Tevel. He featured in the book that I wrote on Copernicus. He was born around 1756, and at the end of towards the end of his life, he writes this book called Mosdot Tevel, which is a 3-part book, one of which is one part of which is a defense of Copernicus, and the second part of it is an explanation of one of Euclid's axioms, and the third part is basically a primer, an ethical will, if you like, about what David Friesenhuisen wanted his children to do. And it's in that third. So I had known about the first part because of my interest in Copernicus, but the third part sort of makes an appearance now in this book because he was very much in favor of the smallpox vaccine. And he writes that it is that while earlier people may have been reasonably afraid of the inoculation, this is a different story. And he writes that I've heard about people who are very intelligent. He says that tzaddikim who have said that it is forbidden for a Jew to be vaccinated and a Jewish child to be vaccinated with cowpox. He says this is absolutely an error. God has, in his great mercy, has revealed it to humanity so that we may be spared this death. If it is true that these poskim, have forbidden the new vaccine, it is a mistake that is causing the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Jewish people. May God forgive them for their error. So David Friesenhuisen had no time, if you like, for the poskim who, and there weren't many of them, there were a few of them, but for people who were concerned about this new tried and tested form of the vaccine. And he concludes by saying, be conscientious, don't tarry, don't delay, save your children from deadly smallpox, give them the cowpox, and it will save them from this disease. So David Friesenhuisen, again, is not in any way mincing his words. He's making it very clear that God has revealed this new technique to us, and we should obviously be doing that for our children.
As you say, there were some who resisted it and were against it. Do you discuss those as well in the book?
Yeah, there weren't many. And there were some. Interestingly, one that I write about in the book is. Let me just remind myself. So there was Marcus Hertz, who was a sort of a Jewish intellectual. He befriended Kant, actually. He went to university where he studied under Kant. The two of them struck up quite a friendship. He later, even though he was 32, he marries a 15-year-old daughter of another Berlin physician, and they established this vibrant intellectual home, a salon where people come and talk. And this, unfortunately, Marcus Hertz really published a polemic against the vaccine, and he had this whole kind of crazy theory about the way medicine worked, and it was completely counterintuitive to him that something that came from an animal would be able to cure a person of disease. And so while he was certainly by no means a posek, he was a very prominent Jew who was not, as far as I know, was not even observant, but who came out very strongly against the vaccine. And this And this reminds us that we can't always put people into boxes where we say, well, people who were university educated always were in favor of it, and people who didn't have a university education and didn't understand it were always against it. There are examples of both happening. And Marcus Hertz, the Jew Marcus Hertz, was an example of a very educated Jew who took a very public stand against smallpox, and he was pillared for it. I mean, it was very clear that that he was on the wrong side of history. We didn't mention, by the way, Yatnachi, Oleh HaTrufa. Let's mention it because it is such an important book, published in 1785 by Abraham Ben Solomon, who writes this book called Oleh HaTrufa, which is a short book where he asks that people inoculate their children for smallpox. He himself lost his children from smallpox, and it's a halachic work where he considers the halachic problems, and he ends up saying that that you absolutely must give the smallpox inoculation, and that's a sefer called Oleh HaTrufa, which was only ever published in one edition. Although interestingly, it was republished in its entirety in 2019, as we entered the vaccine wars around COVID and others, and it was republished anonymously completely. Well, it was republished completely, and included in that were many letters of support from contemporary poskim in favor of childhood vaccines. So it's an interesting book that makes a reappearance in today's ongoing story about the Jewish response to vaccines.
Let's move on to the next pandemic, next disease, if you will, which is cholera, and one that I think came up a fair bit during COVID. If people weren't familiar with it, they became familiar with it then because of the whole Rabbi Akiva Eiger thing. I feel like it was kind of one of the big things during COVID. But you can talk about cholera a little bit, the disease itself, and the Jewish responses, including Rabbi Akiva Eiger.
Yeah, there's so much to say about cholera because, unlike smallpox, which was conquered, even in the early 19th century, it was really conquered. Cholera was a recurrent disease that broke out amongst the Jewish and Gentile communities in Europe. It had been imported from India. It was a new disease. Nobody had really encountered it before about 1820. That's when it really arrived in Poland around 1830. And you have these terrible recurrent outbreaks. It's a waterborne disease. It's caused by contaminated water and it's passed by what's called the fecal-oral route. People not having appropriate sewage. It still to this day is a terrible disease. About almost 3 million people a year get cholera, according to the World Health Organization, and about 100,000 die from it. And it basically you imbibe the cholera virus, and it causes this terrible diarrhea, and within a few hours you basically dehydrate from the diarrhea and can die within a few hours. And this disease swept through Europe in recurrent waves until about the 1850s or 1860s, when famously John Snow, the British physician, showed that it was a waterborne disease. And the story, it's a little bit of a myth, but the story is that John Snow demonstrated this by removing the pump handle of a well in London that was contaminated with cholera, and then you look around and you look at the death rates, and the cholera epidemic was abated. And from that time onwards, everyone understood, or should have understood, that cholera was passed through contaminated water. So we had these waves of cholera that began around 1830 and recurrently since then, and that's where we get the cholera rulings of Rabbi Akiva Eiger, whose rulings really have stood the test of time and were republished during COVID. And the reason for that is because Rabbi Akiva Eiger recommended, or actually imposed, the law that on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the shul should only be half full. Basically, he gave people a choice. You can either go to shul on Rosh Hashanah, or you can go to shul on Yom Kippur, but not both. The only people who could go to both was the rabbis of the Beis Din, and the chazan's wife, and the person who blew the shofar, and his wife. but nobody else would be allowed to attend. And he made these rulings, which to some degree were thought to be helpful in the outbreak of COVID. Some of them were. It's important to note that Rabbi Akiva Eger's rulings did not, in and of themselves, make any difference to cholera. Remember, cholera is a disease that is not transmitted by sitting next to somebody with the disease. The person can't cough it over you. You have to ingest a reasonably large amount of the cholera virus bacteria, and you have to ingest it through this. You can't catch it from somebody else, and so the Rabbi Akiva Eger's insistence that we don't have too many people in the shul did not actually make a difference to the rate of transmission of cholera itself. But nevertheless, they were instructed because he was saying that we will take these, the most holy, important days of the year, and we will have to decide which of the two we will attend. And he also said that there would be police in the shuls to keep order, because Rabbi Akiva Eger knew that the Jews who were told that they could only choose one day would try and sneak in on the other day. So he had policemen checking tickets, and he also had physicians who were stationed at each shul to give advice as to whether or not a person should break their fast on Yom Kippur if they felt unwell and perhaps were coming down with what could be cholera. So these rulings were issued time and again. They made a resurrection in Russia towards the end of the 19th century, and then, as you say, they were widely spread on the internet, and for good reason.
And that also kind of goes together with the story of Rabbi Sol Salanter, that he got up and made Kiddush and ate on Yom Kippur in shul. The question of whether he actually did make Kiddush or not and eat, which you discuss as well in the book.
Yeah, the story of Shlosha She'ochlu, which was written by the famous Yiddish writer David Frischman, and he tells the story, which is a short story and well worth reading, about the three people who ate. They weren't just any people; they were the rabbi, and the leader of the two Dayanim, and Rabbi Yisrael Salant, he says, got up and made Kiddush in front of everybody. By the way, Frischman was not himself an eyewitness to this, but he tells the story. And there has been a lot of discussion in the literature about whether this really happened. Did Rabbi Yisrael Salant make Kiddush? Did he not make Kiddush? And I described the various accounts of the story that have been transmitted through time. In one version, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter never made Kiddush. In the story as told by Frischman and echoed by others, he made Kiddush. And in other stories, he didn't make Kiddush. He just allowed people to eat. So, but it's an important example of how cholera entered the Jewish psyche. So we have a short Yiddish story about whether or not Jews should be eating on Yom Kippur because of the cholera epidemic. That was the subject of a Yiddish short story. So it played a major role in people's thinking.
Yeah, now you do discuss a little bit more on cholera, which is the 1866 cholera epidemic, cholera in Yiddish health manuals, and then the 1902 cholera epidemic and Shemitah, which is interesting, something that you...
Yeah, I just want to pause on that, Nachi, just very briefly. So 1902, there was a terrible cholera epidemic in Palestine that threatened the Yeshuvim of Petach Tikva and Mazkeret Batya and Rishon LeZion, and it coincided with a Shemitah year. And this caused all kinds of problems because the Heter Mechira had not really been fully worked out yet. And the Jewish Yeshuvim were closed, which meant that the Arabs who would have ordinarily come into the Jewish Yeshuvim during Shemitah and worked the land, because there's no problem in an Arab person working the land in Eretz Yisrael, and the people in the Yeshuv would typically go and work the Arab land because it was owned by Arabs. There's no problem in that. This was not allowed during the cholera epidemic, and I discussed at length what happened and the halachic questions of the time. But what was fascinating was that the same thing happened, 100 or so years later, when we had the the COVID pandemic of 2020 that coincided with a Shemitah year, another Shemitah year. And I actually wrote something in Tradition about this, but it was fascinating to see how once again we had, who would have thought that once again we would have the coincidence of a Shemitah cycle and a pandemic. It happened in 1902, and then it happened again in 2020.
Yeah. So that's really cholera, and that brings us to part 2 of the book. And kind of going in order of the book, I think it really is intuitive that way, the way you set it up, and it's interesting, which is religious responses to pandemic. So we get to responses. We're not going to go through each thing individually. Obviously, by the way, the book reads very nice. It flows very well. For an academic book, I was able to read it on a Shabbos afternoon, so it wasn't like a dry, heavy read. And there's a lot of sources. There's a lot here. So this part here is amulets, which is kameas. You talk about the use of kameas, starting with abracadabra, which is not a Jewish command, but
not a Jewish command, but something that has its own Jewish or perhaps Middle Eastern origins. As I point out in the book, yeah.
So talk about kameas before we get to other segulas and other things.
Yeah, these play an amazing role in our history. I mean, to this day, we see people walk around with red strings and the chamsa, the hand, which is there to reflect the spiritual forces, the demons away from us. And this goes way back. And in fact, I mentioned abracadabra. So Rashi talks about the method of abracadabra, and he writes that to get rid of a certain demon called Shavriri, you have to basically say his name, and then you basically say one part of his name less each time. So you go Shavriri, and then you go Viriri, and then you go Riri, and then Yiri, and then just as the name of the demon gets less, so the demon himself, sort of disappears. And I mentioned Sefer Hasidim, which tells an amazing story in which a Jewish woman fell ill, and one of her Gentile neighbors comes to her, it was the son of a Jewish woman, and says, "Why don't you give your son some water to drink that contains a special stone?" And the Jewish woman says, "Where does it come from?" And she says, "Well, it comes from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem." And the Jewish lady says, "Well, I can't give my son to drink that because, we believe something different." And this is told by Sefer Hasidim as an example of the piety of this woman. And of course, it is an example of that. But it would only have been told by Sefer Hasidim if this was something that people were thinking of doing or indeed had done. And so here you have an example, and a couple of academics have pointed this out. Here you have an example of the interreligious exchange of domestic remedies and cures. The most famous, perhaps, example of an amulet, although we probably don't think of it that way, is the mezuzah. The mezuzah is clearly thought to have properties that are of an amulet. It's there for protection, even though the Rambam was very, very against the way that it was being used with angels who were writing additional names of angels that were on the mezuzahs. He didn't do much to quell it. It became an important Kabbalistic idea that the mezuzah was an amulet that could indeed save save you from all kinds of demonic forces. And these amulets were very widespread in Eastern Europe, where of course amulets in the general population were very widespread.
Another fascinating kameas, amulets, is Yudel Rosenberg's kameas, who have a golem infamy, that and other things. Also Talmud Chacham, I think Yodas Nadarim is Sefer Nadarim, and he published a work about kameas as well.
Yes, and that work features in my book, and also features in a fascinating and very enjoyable book called A Frog in, what's it called.
There's a new book by Littman. Yeah, Frog Under the Tongue or something.
Yeah, it's a terrific book on the Jews of Eastern Europe and their A Frog Under the Tongue, and their use of magical amulets and so on. And he in that book he mentions Yidel Rosenberg a great deal. Unfortunately, he never once in that book mentions the fact that Yidel Rosenberg was a serial plagiarizer and forger. Having made up stories about the Maharal and the Golem, and having copied stories from
Doyle, from Sherlock Holmes, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle.
Thank you. From Arthur Conan Doyle, copied stories from him. But nevertheless, Rosenberg, who was writing at the around 1910s, that kind of, he publishes a book in which is full of important, what he believes to be important segulas against various diseases. Just to give you a sense of the kind of thing that Yidel Rosenberg writes, he quotes, for example, a remedy from which he says comes from the Far East, in which dog feces is burned and then sifted, and then you hold it in a child's mouth and you sprinkle it deep into their throat, and that is thought to be a good remedy for diphtheria. So we are talking about very, very basic, unusual remedies that were spread by this character, Yidel Rosenberg.
Yeah, he called it Sefer Rafal HaMalach, but it wasn't just Kameas and Segulas. It was even these kind of weird, kind of folklore kind of remedies.
Yeah, it's an interesting mixture. And again, I one of the things I always try and do in the book is to point out the similarities, or what was going on in the general population. We have to remember that the great chemist Robert Boyle was a big believer in frogs as a way of curing disease, and Robert Boyle was sort of the father of modern chemistry, and so it's not surprising to us that that others, the Jewish people believe this, because everybody believed this, or most people did. Robert Boyle, to this day, there is a prize given out by Britain's Royal Society of Chemistry, and he loved amulets. He had all kinds of cures for diseases, where he would hang horse dung around his neck and on and on like this. Therefore, we have to put these things into context, that for many centuries, people believed this stuff. Now, Boyle, of course, died in 1690, and Yidel Rosenberg is writing about 200 years later, when the germ theory of disease has of course been discovered and understood. So there was less of an excuse for him, but basically, amulets were extremely widespread, and I end that chapter by reminding us that they're widespread to this day. That a study was done in an Israeli intensive care unit several years ago, in which they found that about 30% of Jewish families used amulets and talisman for their children in the intensive care, whether that was red string around the child's wrist or ankle, whether it was a chamsa, whether it was a picture of a rebbe. I mean, these were used by 30% of patients in this was in Asaf HaRofeh hospital, when their children were in the intensive care, so very sick children. And by the way, this is irrespective of the socioeconomic status or the severity of the child's illness. So people who were very well educated also used amulets. It's not necessarily something that is limited to people who are not educated. And it goes to show the real staying power of amulets. I end the chapter reminding us that Walmart will actually can send you you can buy a chamsa hand bracelet, which reflects the negativity by holding its hand and pushing it away from you. So you can buy from Walmart a chamsa online, which goes to show that amulets still have a very significant place in the way that many of us think about disease and the evil eye. Yeah,
I would point out there's a difference between kameas, which a lot of people use, and dog feces and other folk kind of remedies.
One is, one is folk remedies, one are sort of religious folk remedies. Yeah, Yudel Rosenberg, but he basically, in his Sefer, he basically sort of made a cholent out of the whole thing, and that's what makes it such an interesting and alarming read, I think.
Yeah, so let's talk about some other responses, and we'll save the plague wedding for a little bit. But first, the kind of the classic, which is fasting, tinus, prayer, of course, tefillah, and you discuss a little bit of pandemic theology. But just to kind of, talk about those briefly.
Well, the chapter that I have on fasting, prayer, and pandemic theology, I think for me was really one of the most fascinating areas for me to think about, because I had noted during COVID that there was really very little talk about theology. There was some. But in other words, the poskim, the leaders of whichever community you could choose, be it Hasidic, Haredi, modern Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, people were not really asking the most important question of all, which is, how could God let this happen? There was no real accounting of pandemic theology, and it struck me that it was missing in a way, by the way, that other pandemics had. It was not missing from other pandemics. And I'll give you just one very brief example: the example of the HIV pandemic of the early 1980s, in which many people, many important Jewish Orthodox leaders wrote that that pandemic, that HIV pandemic, was a result of the terrible sin of homosexuality. Those same people writing, 40 years later, never once mentioned COVID as coming as a response to sin. And this struck me as really a remarkable shift in the way that Jewish thinkers, Orthodox Jewish thinkers in this case, have perhaps evolved in their thinking. So for example, most of the halachic works that address COVID talk about the structure of the balcony, and whether you can use it to make up a minyan. Do you have to be able to see each other? Whether you can do Bikur Cholim over the phone, and on and on. Nobody sits with the thorny question of, how does God let this happen? And the question of pandemic theology, it was raised by the Talmud, and Rav Yosef, who died in 325, was very clear about it. Rav Yosef's shitta was that during a pandemic, the angel of death is released, and he will claim the lives of the innocent together with those who deserve death. According to Rav Yosef, death is random during a pandemic, which is a remarkable thing for us to sort of grapple with. And unfortunately, and I hope that people will grapple with this is really not, I think, received the kind of attention that it needs to. One notable exception was a series of essays in a book published in 2021 by Rabbi Aaron Leib Smokler of Yeshivat Maharat, in which they do indeed address plague, the question of theodicy. How can God let bad things happen to good people? I don't think in the end many of the suggestions there are particularly convincing, but at least people are trying to think about this. At least they are taking it on as an important area. For example, amongst the conservative and reform movements, there were lots of things online about how to run an online Shabbat service, and there were prayers to be said for doctors and nurses. But remarkably, among the conservative and reform movement, again, there was no talk about theology. So this was not just an absence amongst the Orthodox Jewish population. It really was absent across the spectrum. And then when we moved to sort of the more right wing, what we might call, approaches, there were again the attempts at pandemic theology were really, really lacking. A couple of books published said the reason that the pandemic was sent, I'm not making this up, is because to teach Jews the value of not talking in shul, so we didn't realize it, so God shuttered our shuls. I mean, the idea behind that God would cause a pandemic and the deaths of millions of innocent people so that Jewish people would stop talking during shul is quite repugnant to anybody who thinks about it. And yet this is the kind of approach to theology that we are left with. And we really need some serious thought to be put to how we deal with pandemic theology. Unfortunately, much of the discussion was about, do we say Tachnun during Nisan, during the pandemic? Should we carry on as normal, not saying Tachnun, or should we actually say Tachnun because it's a terrible time? I mean, yes, that's an important question, but it's not the important question of the day. And so I do hope that perhaps in the years to come, we will see another attempt to sort of think about pandemic theology in a way, for example, that the Holocaust generated a large body of literature about how God could let the Holocaust happen, or God be behind the Holocaust, right? If God was behind the Holocaust, what kind of a God is he that would allow such a terrible thing? And if God wasn't behind the Holocaust, then what point is God? And we have those same questions asked time and again here amongst the pandemics. So there are some similarities there, and I discuss them. But I think at the end of the day, our thought leaders across the Jewish spectrum really need to grapple with the question of theodicy, and specifically pandemic theodicy, about how God allows good people to die in a pandemic.
Yeah, and not for here, and not commenting on what the Torah leaders said or didn't say. Maybe this has to do with the broader Jewish theology and hashkafa and these type of svarim and thought, and people don't really learn or read that now or whatever. Maybe that has to do with it. Again, I'm just making a comment. I'm not, that, but it's you point out some interesting points in the book and here as well. You also point about, like I said, you discuss fasting in general, and as a response to pandemics and during COVID. Also, tefillah, various prayers, and you talk about Pitum Akteris. That's something that's always been done, for a while in response to pandemics. But we should talk more about, you have a whole chapter dedicated on the plague wedding, these weddings that occurred in cemeteries. They actually was reenacted. It was kind of enacted during COVID, but it's kind of a really weird gotta know to do, and explain what the tradition is. Take two orphans or two people. Yeah. What happened? Where is it from?
Plague wedding, for until COVID, the plague wedding was really a bizarre corner of Jewish history, Jewish religious history, that very few people knew about. I had come across it actually in an interesting way. I wrote a book on the history of influenza, and believe it or not, I came across a plague wedding in response to the influenza pandemic that occurred both in the Ukraine and also in New York, and also in Canada. And that was my first sort of exposure to this. I came to it in a very backwards way, if you like. But I dedicate a whole chapter to this one, I think quite odd ceremony for us as modern Jews. In the plague wedding, a young, maybe what we would call today a Nevish couple, perhaps they were orphans, perhaps they had a handicap of some sort, and they were married. And the community took the young man and the young woman, are actually sometimes very old, an older bride and groom, people who had not married and were now in their senior years, brought them to a cemetery, wedded under a marriage canopy that was often black. And everybody would sort of watch from the cemetery as this occurred. Generally, these were associated with a great deal of eating and drinking and merrymaking. And the last example that I had known of a plague wedding happened during the Holocaust somewhere between 1940 and 1942. And that actually took place in Zelikow, in Poland, under the eyes of the Nazis. And we actually have a Yiddish account of this, which I had translated and include in an appendix in my book. So we have a full account of this typhus, when a typhus epidemic broke out around the year 1940. A plague wedding was held under the eyes of the Nazis. And I thought that was the last time that it would ever occur. But as you point out, it sort of became famous once again in March of 2020, This time there was a drone that was flying around the Ponovich cemetery in Bnei Brak that showed a small plague wedding, also known as a Schwarzer wedding, a black wedding, or a cholera wedding, has different names, and showed maybe a few dozen onlookers looking at, standing among the fresh graves, looking at this young and quite honestly frightened-looking couple who were married there, and that was actually the last plague wedding. So quite remarkably, we had a new plague wedding in 2020 when the last known plague wedding of which I was aware was in 1942. So in the book, I talk about the phenomena of plague weddings. They occurred in Jerusalem in 1866. They occurred all over Eastern Europe. There are at least 19 accounts in memorial books of communities that were destroyed in the Holocaust, stories of towns and villages where this occurred. I reprint and translate actually a surviving wedding invitation that invited people to come and celebrate a plague wedding, and it happened, as I say, a great deal in Eastern Europe. It happened in North America. There was a plague wedding in Philadelphia, and that happened in 1918 in response to the Great Flu pandemic, which, as I said, was the way that I learned about it. There was another plague wedding in Winnipeg, Canada, which was reported in the media. They called it the Wedding of Death, an ancient Hebrew ceremony established about 2,000 years ago. Completely wrong. There is no record of the Schwarzer Chasna, the cholera wedding, before about the late 18th century. None whatsoever, and historians to this day do not really understand from where it came. One suggestion is that it was associated with the church, because if you as you know, many sort of small churches, certainly in England where I grew up, and I'm sure in Europe, church is surrounded by a cemetery. That's where people are buried, and the wedding would often proceed out of a church through the cemetery and out. And so one suggestion is that this was the origin of the Jewish people connecting a cemetery with a wedding. But it remains very, very, sort of, we don't know. But it's mentioned in Sefer Matamim, which is a book of customs. Otzer Minhagei Yeshurun, it's mentioned in that book as well. And as I say, it was typically there was a great deal of merriment, of joy. There was liquor being passed. I mean, these appear in the newspaper accounts of the plague wedding, and they were associated with a great deal of joy. In fact, quite spectacularly, I came across a children's book, which is now in my library, a children's book, which is a wonderful cartoon of a rabbi who has done everything possible to end the cholera epidemic. And the rabbi decides that he's going to hire a band and he's going to have a plague wedding. And the cartoon book is called The Wedding That Saved the Town, published in 2009. You can buy it online. And it has a wonderful cartoon of a plague wedding occurring through, among the tombstones in a village in Eastern Europe. And happily, the wedding takes place, and the plague is abated. So you can certainly see that to this day, people were still interested in the phenomena of plague weddings, so much so that somebody thought it was an entirely appropriate subject for a children's book.
Yeah. So then we get to the last part of the book, or the last part, third part, anti-Jewish responses to pandemic. So the first chapter we've already discussed. That's about the Black Death and anti-Jewish violence. So it's here, but like you said, there's 2 chapters on the Black Death, but we kind of discussed that already. The next chapter that you discuss is a menace to the health of the country, the Jewish immigrant as a carrier of disease, which is a real anti-Semitic trope that you can imagine being bandied about, that the Jews are bringing it with them. Dirty Jewish immigrant, as you say, as if there was only Jewish immigrants, but this is something that's been pinned on the Jews, and something that you go through. I don't know if you want.
Yeah, we should also point out, very briefly that it has always been a response to pandemics to blame outsiders, right? So it happened. The Germans were blamed for Palatine fever that was, that hit Philadelphia. We have always, the French were blamed for the outbreak of bubonic plague in London. We have always blamed the outsider. And that is a response to pandemics. It's almost a law of a response to pandemics. So in this example, it was the Jews who were associated with diseases like tuberculosis, with cholera, with sometimes with typhus. And I go through the book carefully, describing some of those outrageous statements that were made, even for the time. They were pretty remarkably outrageous. Statements made by medical journals, by the New York Times, about that we don't need these dirty Jewish immigrants. We have enough problems of our own. And of course, it turned out that it was nothing to do with being Jewish. It was to do with being poor. It was to do with not having, running water and clean sewage. A boat that brought many Jews over from Hamburg and was, had many cases of cholera that sparked a sort of a public health outcry in New York. Turned out that the Jews were on the boat, but the cholera was brought because the boat had filled up in Hamburg, where the river was contaminated with cholera. So it was nothing to do with the Jewish immigrant. It was to do with the settings in which they found themselves. And it's an important story to remember as we think about, the poor, the impoverished, and the association between disease, and not with religion, but with socioeconomic opportunities.
Yeah, and then I said that was the last part. That's not the last section of the book. The last section of the book, part 4, is modern pandemics, which is, as we've alluded to, is the last chapters on COVID-19. And I'm not sure how much people want to hear about COVID again, but you can talk a little bit about COVID. And the other part is, working backwards, chapter 11 is the right to die, Jewish anti-vaxxers, and the limits of rabbinic authority. You go through the first Jewish anti-vaxxers, and you go through kind of anti-vax. So those are the two final chapters.
Yeah, the story, briefly, I think the anti-vaxxer chapter is a very, very important story, really, because I learned a great deal from it. And I learned that the mainstream Haredi response to vaccines was to be completely supportive of them. And before, back in the sort of the 20-teens, when we had the question about the MMR vaccine and the lies that were adopted about that, we had contemporary Haredi poskim like Yitzchak Zilberstein and Moshe Sternbuch, perhaps the leading Haredi rabbi of his time, who ruled that the measles vaccine had to be given, and that a principal of a high school was perfectly within their rights to refuse entry to children who have not been vaccinated. This is an important story to tell because of the way that we have come to hear about vaccine skepticism amongst some members of the Haredi Jewish community, and it is certainly true that it happens there. But it also happens in other communities. And as I point out in that chapter, I have come to see that these are not, we don't have Jewish anti-vaxxers. We have anti-vaxxers who happen to be Jewish. And this was a big chiddush for me, and at least in the way that I saw this, because the anti-vaxxers are Jewish, but they have much more in common with the other anti-vaxxers who are out there, who of course have nothing to do with religion of any sort. These are anti-vaxxers who, as a religion, have Judaism, but their main identity, if you like, or part of their main identity, is as an anti-vaxxer, and they have much in common with anti-vaxxers elsewhere, and I go into great detail in that. So I think it's a very important chapter for people who want to, number one, understand what the Haredi and what the poskim response to vaccines was, how that was changed in the United States. The leaders in the United States, some of the leaders, I should say, decided that the Piskei Din coming from Jerusalem did not, they could make their own. And look, you live in Lakewood, so you know this only too well about the machlokas that there was in Lakewood over the rights and wrongs of people who were spreading spreading anti-vax disinformation. So I think it's a very important chapter for anybody who really wants to understand what happened and why it happened.
Yeah, and that's chapter 11, where you discuss, like I said, you start at the beginning with the first Jewish anti-vaxxers, and then you continue through until today. And then chapter 12 is a plague of biblical proportions, Jews and Judaism in the age of COVID-19. So this is something that's familiar. It's not like, I mean, I guess it is. You can talk about this, meaning what is interesting to someone about this chapter who, we all went through COVID-19. So what is, it's not as historical as learning about the responses to cholera or smallpox or bubonic plague. It's very, very different, this chapter. So, but first of all, I want to point out, even though you do mention COVID throughout the book, this chapter alone, this chapter about COVID is around 25 pages. So it's quite small. The length of the book is over 300 pages. So as I said in the beginning, the book is not about COVID. But anyways, why should someone read this chapter? What's the chiddush of this chapter exactly?
What's the chiddush of the chapter? Great question. I learned a lot as I had to, we're still writing the history of COVID. Look, quite honestly, we still don't know where it came from. But what I tried to do in this chapter was, firstly, I tried to show how much of the response to things that had happened to the Jewish community had happened before. So, for example, the anti-Semitic response to COVID-19, the Jewish toll of COVID-19, which was really terrible, and the ways in which different Jewish communities responded to the outbreak, both in terms of their response to communal prayer. We have to think about not only what we did as Orthodox Jews, but it's a good question: how did the conservative movement respond to the question of a communal prayer? And there are some important stories to tell about that the larger Jewish community, not just our own. And I think it's also an important chapter because it brings out something that was, again, it was a chiddush for me, which was the way to think about some of the bad behavior, and there was bad behavior that went on during the COVID pandemic from our community. And some of that behavior, I think, can be understood in terms of the ways that, not the way that Jewish people responded, but the way that fundamentalists people with a more fundamentalist approach to religion, how they responded. And it turns out that if you are a member of a more fundamentalist version of your religion, whether that's Christian, whether that's Muslim, whether that's Jewish, you are more likely, number one, to distrust governments. You are, number two, more likely to distrust health information. And you are also, interestingly, much more likely to be involved in communal activity. We have tefillah, but so do other religious groups that come together as a community. And so when we saw the way in which COVID affected some of these communities and some of the ways in which they were very disparaging of the healthcare guidance that was coming out, it's important to note that these were not particularly Jewish responses. We may have seen them that way, but they were responses of people who practice a more, if you like, fundamentalist kind of religion. So that was very important for me. It helped me understand what was going on. It wasn't necessarily a let's call it a right-wing, Jewish response, but it was a response of people who were in a certain mindset, and that mindset affects Jews and non-Jews as well.
Okay, and that's here in the...
That's the last chapter. Well, that's part of the last chapter.
Yes, in the book. So I want to talk a little bit about your sources. You mentioned you have a lot of sources and a wide variety of sources, all different types, as we've kind of alluded to and mentioned here: Jewish, non-Jewish, halachic, non-halachic. How do you go about finding these sources?
Well, the way that I write a book is I just do a deep dive into it. It takes, I said at the beginning that this book sort of wrote itself, and it really did. The sources were so interesting that each source begged to have a part in the book, as it were. How do I find the sources? You go back to the primary material. You can also start with with academic papers and footnotes and shilas and shuvas, and then there are search functions that we have, Otzar Chochma. Once you start in this area, as I said, the finding the sources was that in many ways was the easy part. The harder part was deciding which sources not to include, because unfortunately there are so many of them that I had to make a decision as to what not to put into the book. And I know authors often say this, but it's really true. So we have a very, very deep literature in the Hebrew literature on plagues, all kinds of plagues and pandemics, and it was important for me to sort of share those as much as I could. So some of it was happenstance, some of it was colleagues who sent me stuff, a lot of it was other academic writers and their footnotes. Some of it was going to libraries. There was one source, a very important source in the history of smallpox and the approach of Jews that I could only find in one specific library at the National Institutes of Health that was closed during COVID. Unfortunately, a very nice librarian said to me, "Look, you can't come in because the library is closed, but I'm going to send you a PDF of this book," which I couldn't find anywhere else. And so, that's the hard work of being an author. But I'm very proud of the end product, and I think the listeners will be as equally interested in the story of the relationship between Jews and pandemics.
Yeah, which is what I was going to ask you. So if someone is sick, pardon the pun, sick of hearing about COVID, and as I've said, it's not about COVID and pandemics and illness, and if they're not someone that's a medical person, they don't know anything about medical per se and diseases, why should they read the book?
Yeah. Well, as you say, it ends with COVID, and it's definitely not about COVID. This could have been a book that was titled "The Story of the Jewish People and Infectious Disease." Look, today we have a lot of thin understandings of things. Thin meaning, I'm going to read a wiki page, or I'm going to read a brief post that's going to summarize this for me. And I think what we also need, as we owe it to ourselves, is to have a thick understanding of things. And really, the only way that you get a thick understanding of a topic is to read a book about it. And I make no bones about that. I think there is no replacement for a book about historical topics, about religious topics. And this book will provide you with that thick understanding so that you can put your own experience, our own experience, into context. As I mentioned, nearly everything that happened to us as a Jewish community, wherever you lay on the spectrum of Jewish communities, was predictable, was something that has happened in the past to Jewish communities. And understanding that really, at least for me, helped me understand what was going on today. I also think that the story that I tell, an important part of that story, is how Jews differed and how they were similar to the wider non-Jewish communities in which they were living. And time and again, I will compare the actions or the Piskei Din or the responses of Jews and rabbinic leaders of the time with other leaders, whether they be church fathers. We mentioned, for example, fasting. Well, there is a long history of fasting for pandemics in Great Britain. There were many fasts that were proclaimed by the king. There was a famously fast in the United States that were proclaimed, it was a natural thing for people to fast, and it wasn't just the Jewish people who were doing that. So, bringing things into context like that is also an important thing that you'll get from the book, which also shows, as I said, how our reactions are shaped by the world in which we live. It also shows, as we've just been discussing, how much we owe to vaccines and clean sewage. We take our clean, healthy lives for granted. And when COVID struck us, we were appalled that we didn't have a ready response. And the truth of the matter is, this was the regular life of Jews for all of our existence up until the modern era. I talk about plagues and pandemics for Jews being like the weather. It was always there. Sometimes you noticed it and sometimes you didn't. So to understand what we owe to vaccines and the medical advances that we've made and the public health advances that we've made, you'll also get that from the book, and you'll realize what a dangerous place the world was not so very long ago. You'll also understand, we've just mentioned it, why anti-vaxxers, Jewish anti-vaxxers, are not a new phenomena, and why they're very much outside the realm of normative Jewish belief and practice. And you'll have all the sources that you need on that. And I also tell the story of many Jewish heroes who may have gone unnoticed, whether they were the leaders of the ghettos in Padua and Rome during the pandemic, the Jewish leaders there, whether they were the Russian Jewish doctors who volunteered and who died saving Russians during the outbreaks of cholera there, whether it was Glickel's grandmother who died saving refugees with bubonic plague. These are the heroes, the unsung heroes of our history, who until now I think have gone unnoticed. I think the book is really a new way of thinking about Jewish history. I'm not claiming it's the only way, but it is indeed it's a new way of understanding what has happened to us as a people, this time through the lens of infectious disease.
There's one more thing that I want to ask you about. I mentioned this all the way in the beginning, which is in the beginning of the book, you have a few pages, a chronology of Jews, plagues, and pandemics. What is that? How did you put that together?
I thought it was important to lay out right at the beginning the way in which pandemics had affected us in a visual way. So I put together, as you said, starting with the 10 plagues around the 13th century BC, before the Common Era, and then all the way through to 2020, where I end. And you will see over a half a dozen pages or so the list of leading poskim whose lives came to a terrible and abrupt end from pandemics. I mean, the Ari died at the age of 35 from bubonic plague. The way in which our Jewish intellectual history has been sort of cut short by plagues is remarkable. So this was a list that I could put together from things that I knew about, from searches that I had done online. This took several, independent days, as well as a lot of background work to put this together. But if you just flick through this, you will see, goodness me, in 1677, the Jewish quarter near Krakow was abandoned because of plague. You'll see that, in 1813, how Yisrael ben Shmuel of Shklov, who led the Jewish community in Israel, who was a disciple of the Vilna Gaon, who fled at Tzfat, he made Aliyah, he went to live in Tzfat, he lost his wife, 4 of his children, and he later wrote a very important sefer that started to this day on the Hilachot of Shemitah. And this sefer was written as a result of his experiences and his promise to write a book if he were to survive the outbreak of pandemics. You'll see how there's a mention about the Jews of Jamaica who were forced to leave Jamaica because of pandemics, and on and on and on. And again, it gives us a sense of the very, very vast way in which pandemics have affected the history of the Jewish people. That it's not about COVID-19 and something about bubonic plague and I'm done. Maybe something about Rebbe Akiva Eiger. There's a very deep, profound relationship between the way that we have developed our tefillah, the way that we've developed our communities, and the way in which we've been affected by plagues. So I put that in the book. It took a lot of work, and I think that that will help frame the discussions that come after it.
Just one final, question. I think the last time when we discussed Copernicus, this was you teased that this is what you were working on. Do you have any plans now, or now as a break?
No. I have some other things that I'd like to write. Much of it to do with what I discovered in this book. But I have to make a decision whether the next book's going to be again Jewish focused or more focused on my day job, as it were. We'll see. But lots of good material that I'm already gathering, and I've had very nice feedback from the book, and I'm happy to discuss, the contents of the book with anybody who'd like to write to me. And as I say, it might strike readers at the beginning as a weird and sort of a downer, something that we're really reluctant to talk about. But I find the story, and other people have told me that the story, you finished the book yourself, is an uplifting story. It's a way in which the Jewish people have conquered natural, disease, infectious disease, how they've been part of the story of how it was conquered, and how our own religious responses have been shaped by it. And I think it's a remarkably uplifting story that we need to know more about.
Yes, there's a lot of it. It is, and there's a lot of really fascinating, interesting things that you can learn from reading the book. So thank you, Dr. Brown, for joining me once again. And I'll put a link in the show's notes for the book. Anyone interested can check it out and purchase it.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, Nachi.